My name is Stephen Fortney. I'm a long-time resident of the city of Stoughton. I was a school teacher here for 31 years. I was an alderman for over 20, but I spend most of my time writing books. And one of the books that I have done, as you can see here, is the book about Paul Kraby. Paul Kraby was a policeman in the city of Stoughton, and he is the only policeman who was killed in the line of duty. Go back historically to a night of September 30th, 1934. It's very dark, close to 1 o'clock in the morning, and this Paul Kraby, who has been a policeman for less than a year, is doing his duty. This is a picture of him as a policeman doing a patrol on Main Street down in the vicinity of the railroad track and of a coal business down where the current railroad station exists now. It's a very dark night. It's close to 1 o'clock in the morning. Paul's doing his route. He has a nighttime route that he does every night. And suddenly, there's a blast of a shotgun. Somebody has been hiding in the vicinity of the coal yard, armed with a 12-gauge shotgun, leveled at Paul's head, and he lets loose a shot, the shot of which hits Paul in the head, mostly, kills him instantly. The policeman falls to the sidewalk, and he is dead before he hits the ground. The next morning, of course, the police are there. The rest of the police are there. There's a huge crowd of citizens of the city of Stoughton. Paul was a very popular man. He was a decent sort. His adjudication of the law was gentle and understanding. Typically, he would apprehend a person who may have had too much to drink, and instead of bullying him, he marched him to the holding cell, put him in there, let him sleep it off. And when he woke up, he would gently talk to him about the evils of drink and how he was going to have to deal with his wife, so on and so forth. That's the kind of person he was. The story in the book here is a twofold story. First of all, it has to do with the solution of the crime. And secondly, it is a kind of Valentine to the city of Stoughton. The story unites itself at the end. At that point, I will read a passage for your understanding. And you get a total picture of the city in its violence on the one hand and in its serenity on the other. Stoughton was settled by New Englanders. Luke Stoughton was from Vermont. But during the course of his career, there was a significant Norwegian immigration to the area. Most of the immigrants were from the Sognefjord area of Norway, with a few telemarkers thrown in to the mix. The Sognefjord is on the west coast of Norway. It is the deepest and the most beautiful fjord in Norway. My own people came from the very end of Sognefjord in Fortonsdal, which accounts for my name. The name Fortney is a version of Fortun. And we spoke an unusual dialect of Norwegian, not the worst and the most incomprehensible dialect that belongs to the Voss area, but the Sogning dialect is a little bit unusual and sometimes a little hard to understand. For example, instead of saying "Jeg vet ikke," I don't know, we would say "Jeg vet ikke." Instead of saying 17. Mai, which is a celebration that we have here, Independence Day, we say 16. Mai, and the whole dialect is pretty much that different. And so the people that gathered around the railroad tracks from the site of the murder, Paul's body had been removed already by this time, were speaking to each other in English for the most part, but every once in a while they would lapse into the Sogning dialect of Norwegian. And there was a kind of division in town at the time. The Yankees, the Americans as they were sometimes called, were the original settlers. They owned most of the businesses. They ran the stores and were part of the political establishment. The Norwegians began to emigrate in the 1840s, but most strongly at the time that Targa Gunnarsson Mont originated or founded the wagon factory in Stoughton, and he hired a lot of people from Norway to come to work for him in the factory, and then the settlement began. My own family, who had a farm in Dunn County in northwest central Wisconsin, had in fact a mant wagon. And my father told me one time that the first word he learned to spell out was M-A-N-D-T. They had a mant wagon, and he learned to spell that particular word. There was a tension between the two groups. The hostility showed up in a number of different places, but one place that it did show up was City Council, where Norwegians would be contesting against the Yankees, the Americans, for the political power of the town. In the 1930s, for the most part, the Norwegians were in charge of the city council. They had built this wonderful opera house in the city. We sometimes wonder how on earth all of these tight Norwegians got together to spend a lot of money for an opera house and a city hall, but they did that. The other part of the city of Stoughton was its violence. Now, when I first moved here in the 50s, Stoughton had the reputation of being a really tough town. They were not exactly gangs, but they were groups of high school-age boys that took no nonsense from anybody from outside. We were told that the young men from Oregon, which is not too far from Stoughton, would always be envious of the boys and girls of Stoughton, and particularly were fond of the Stoughton girls because they were the most beautiful in Dane County, the nice blonde, blue-eyed Norwegian type. But the basis for the violence was the Prohibition. The Prohibition had ended by 1934. However, Stoughton was a dry town. It was not allowed to sell hard liquor in the city of Stoughton. And as a consequence of that, there was a good deal of smuggling. Probably a lot from the Milwaukee area, probably a lot from Canada coming into town to be distributed to Milwaukee and to Chicago. Some contact with the gangsters of Chicago and so on and so forth. And as a consequence of this, there was a lot of money that was flowing into town, and the question always was, who was in charge of the money, how was it distributed, so on and so forth. And the story was that Paul came to the city of Stoughton from Norway when he was 17 years old. He didn't speak any English. He had relatives here, and I need to show you the three girls that were his relatives. These three young women. Their names were Lida Burrell Spurley, Edna Burrell Ripken, Polly Burrell Hansen. And my favorite of the three was this one, Polly. I call her Auntie Polly in the book. She will figure as one of the major characters in the book. The three girls taught Paul English. But Paul also was a very loyal citizen. And one of the things that he did was to enlist in the army in time for World War I. He served in the army in some of the most violent battles of that particular war. He was a close friend of the father of Bob Burrell, who lived in town here, and who died recently from his home in Vernon County. I was able to interview Paul for this book, or not Paul, but Bob Burrell for this book, and got a few interesting insights as to the relationship of Bob's father and Paul Kraby. Paul was a policeman, and he began to hear things about some of the shenanigans that were going on in town. The sisters, after having taught him English, would talk to him about some of the issues in town. There's a long story of a party that one of the characters of the book attended to find out how much the sisters had told Paul about the things that were happening in town, the crooked things that were happening. And they had an advantage. The advantage was a clever one that all of us, having grown up in a Norwegian-American family, knew about. If they wanted to keep a secret, they didn't speak English to each other, they spoke Norwegian. And so, one of the main characters is the subject of an apparent attempt to create a kind of reconciliation of the two groups. Clara Mantel. Clara was the daughter of Targa Gunnarsson Manthi, the founder of the wagon work, and Giles Dow, part of the Yankee family in town. They married in an attempt, almost a medieval attempt, to unite two kingdoms. This party occurred, or one of the parties occurred, with a group of women called the Happy Hour Club. And one of my characters, and I'll get into that in just a second, attended this particular party, and they began to talk about the issues, the unfortunate and sometimes almost criminal issues of the behavior of the men of the town. And of course, when Giles showed up, or any of the Yankees showed up, they went immediately into Norwegian. And the conversation between Paul and his three cousins, the three sisters were his cousins, was a lot of it was in Norwegian, and he began to ask questions about what was going on in town, some of the questionable things that were happening. He began to learn too much, according to the girls, and the point of all of that was that maybe they had told him so much that he became a danger to himself, and he was eliminated as a consequence of what he knew, and most specifically what he was about to do. He never got a chance to do that. He was killed on that date of September 30th, 1934, part of the violent matrix of the town itself, part of the divisions of the town between the Norwegian and the Americans, the English, the Yankees, and all that kind of potential for conflict. The story that I wrote, I have invented 3 characters, and the 3 characters are apprentice journalists working for the 3 major newspapers of the area: Capital Times, Wisconsin State Journal, and the Courier Hub. And these are 3 apprentice journalists, 3 apprentice reporters. They get together immediately after the murder, and they decide to work with their reporters, who are the actual reporters by name that reported on all of these issues, and see what they could do to find out who was responsible for the assassination. The 3 reporters are mirror images of the 3 newspapers. Wisconsin State Journal is more conservative, more staid of the 3 newspapers. The Capital Times is Bill Eview's newspaper, which was a crusading, radical paper. And then, of course, the Courier Hub, which is a local paper who had his finger on most of the issues that were going on in the town. And the 3 reporters reflected those 3 newspapers. And they go around, they begin to do interviews, they look at this thing and that thing, and they become closer and closer to what they think is the truth. They know that there may be one individual who was in charge of laundering the money, of distributing the money, and so on and so forth. One of the things that they were curious about was how the person who was accused of the assassination was able to afford a very expensive hotshot attorney from Madison by the name of McIntyre. Joe Pliner was arrested as a person of interest. He was tried, and ultimately he was acquitted. He was acquitted on the basis of some very clever lawyering on the part of this McIntyre. The idea was Joe Pliner probably would never have been acquitted except for the skills of this attorney, very expensive attorney. And the question came, who paid for that attorney? Because Joe Pliner had no money. The 3 reporters get closer and closer to an answer to this. And one of the people that was suspected of this purchase was this man, Giles Dow, who was a very important figure in the city of Stoughton at the time and afterwards. He got all kinds of honors, but there was among the Norwegians he was a kind of a bad guy, and the suspicion began to get closer and closer to him. This is his wife. This is Clara Mant Dow. She's the one at whose house happy hour parties have always occurred. And one of the main female characters of the story is who I call Aunt Polly. Get close to the picture of her here. Who was one of the 3 cousins. And this is a picture of her as a young girl on the one hand and as an older woman on the other. My wife was a member of one of the social clubs that this woman was also a member of, and so we have some close connection to some of these women. I happened to be in a car with Aunt Clara at one point. We were going from some party place on the one hand to her home in the Osbjornson house that one evening. She was something like 97 years old, and she leapt out of the car and strode toward her house with more vigor than I myself could ever have accomplished. Very, very interesting and strong woman. The second or the third part of the story has to do with the Valentine, as I mentioned to you, of the city of Stoughton itself. And the symbol for that Valentine in the book is a detailed description of some of the elegant houses that have been built in this town. And of the elegant houses, they all have porches. And porches are featured all the way through the book. This happens to be the porch of a house that I myself once lived in. This is the parsonage of the Our Savior's Lutheran Church, where my dad was pastor. And so this is one of the porches that I feature, among many, many others. I have a whole file of hundreds of porches in the city of Stoughton. The porches were symbols because people sat on them, and people would march along the sidewalk for their evening walks, and the people on the porches would hail them. They would have conversations with them. It was a very social kind of situation. We lived in such a house in Menominee, Michigan, and we had people passing by all the time, and conversations occurred. There's a certain solidarity and a certain human dimension to the houses that were built during this period from about the 1860s all the way up until the 1920s. The houses now have no porches. They're just doors next to garage doors. That's what you have. We have what I call in the book a society that is featured by the solipsism of the automobile. There's no social interaction between the front door of a house these days and the people that are walking on the sidewalk. So the story deals with the murder, the attempted solution, the conflict between the Norwegians and the Yankees, the violence of the town during the Depression and during the smuggling area at the time, and then, of course, the lovely elegance of the older houses that you have built in this town. The main character, my reporter, is a hub reporter. There's a lot about newspaper work in here that is really very interesting. Has grown up in this town. He has interviewed people having to do with the Depression and the difficulties of the time. He lives his entire life here. His daughter, Christine, one of three girls that grew up in town, reflects at the end of this book, which is at the time of the celebration of Paul Kraby's death, the honoring of him on the 30th of September, where the police get together and have a memorial service. She is in attendance. She's been invited because of her connection to the story. And she reflects a little bit toward the end of the book on the meaning of this story for her and her father. I will read just a short selection of this. The name of the daughter is Christine. Christine, Carl Hansen's oldest daughter, had been invited by the police department to attend the memorial. She had been born in Stoughton just before Krabi was killed. Her father was not buried here. His ashes had been scattered in the Wisconsin North Woods near their Trigo cabin. Polly, who during the war, here's a picture of her when she lived in Washington, D.C., working for the Treasury Department. I'll get my finger out of the way, was the object of great affection to this Carl Hansen. There was 30 years difference between the two of them, but he was really fond of her and maybe even a little bit in love with her. Polly moved back home eventually. Even in her old age, she was athletic and vigorous. She never owned a car. She walked everywhere, even for grocery shopping. Her striding swiftly through Stoughton downtown was a common sight. And then the last part, porches, empty porches. She is at the gravestone of Polly Hansen, Aunt Polly. The plague, invisible, terrible, pervasive, and the stain of a murder, unsolved and unpunished, equally pervasive. Those things, particularly the last, stuck in her father's mind. And as much as he loved his town, the murder of Paul Kraby cast a shadow. That's the way of the world, Christine thought, adjusting the mask that protected her nose and mouth, fallen with a serpent in every garden. But her father, whose devotion as a journalist and teacher to the truth and the right was a lifelong, in spite of the bitter injustice of an unpunished killing, had still loved it here to the end. Anyway, end of the book. Krabi.